In July of 1893, a man named Herman Webster Mudgett, who called himself Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, made a declaration to the city of Chicago that shocked even the most seasoned detectives of the Pinkerton National Agency, that the top floor of his hotel, a sprawling, gas-lit labyrinth of sealed rooms and soundproofed corridors rising at the corner of Wallace and 63rd Street, was still under construction, unfinished, inaccessible, not ready for guests. No one questioned him, and that, in the end, is what made it the most efficient killing machine the American continent had ever produced. Not unfinished because of money, not unfinished because of permits, but unfinished because a finished floor had doors that opened from the inside, and Holmes had spent 3 years ensuring that none of his did. The floor above the World's Fair Hotel was a place where the geometry of architecture became the geometry of death. Rooms that narrowed to nothing, chutes that dropped into a basement laboratory, vaults sealed with poured concrete, and walls so thick that the sound of a human voice, or something more desperate than a voice, could not reach the street below. One detail, recovered from a deposition filed on November 3, 1894, remains so disturbing that the original document was sealed by order of the Cook County Circuit Court and has never been fully reproduced in any public record. The room dimensions on the unfinished floor were not measured in feet. They were measured in the average width of a human shoulder. By October of 1893, when the World's Columbian Exposition had drawn 27 million visitors to Chicago, a city drunk on ambition, electricity, and the smell of its own greatness, at least 9 people connected to that hotel had simply ceased to exist. No bodies, no letters home, no final sightings, just the peculiar silence that follows when a city is too loud to notice its own disappearances. Holmes would later claim the number was much higher. Investigators, when they finally broke through the sealed concrete in the summer of 1895, would stop counting after they found the surgical table in the basement. Before we uncover the full truth of what happened on that unfinished floor, the confessions, the blueprints, and the one witness who survived by doing something no one should ever have had to do, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story reaches, because what happened in Chicago in 1893 didn't stay in Chicago. It only moved somewhere quieter.
The summer of 1893 in Chicago smelled like 2 things simultaneously, and the combination was enough to disorient anyone who arrived by train from the quieter parts of the country. It smelled like ambition, the hot mineral tang of freshly poured concrete, of sawdust and iron filings, of gas lamps burning through the lakeside fog at 4 in the morning because the construction crews never stopped, because the city had promised the world a spectacle, and the world had bought tickets. And underneath that smell, threading through it like a dark vein through pale stone, was the other smell, the stockyards. The Union stockyards on the South Side processed more animal flesh per day than any facility on Earth, and on certain evenings, when the wind came off the prairie from the southwest, all of Chicago, its grand hotels, its new electric streetcar lines, its white-columned exposition halls, was wrapped in the unmistakable scent of blood being converted into commerce. This was the city that H. Holmes chose, not by accident, never by accident. The winter preceding the fair had been brutal, in the specific way that Chicago winters punish those who are not from there. Not simply cold, but aggressive, a cold that had purpose, that found the gaps in your coat and your confidence with equal efficiency. The spring thaw came late, in April, turning the unpaved side streets of Inglewood into channels of brown water that swallowed boots whole. By May, when the exposition officially opened on the lakefront, the city had endured months of tension, labor disputes in the rail yards, a smallpox outbreak in the tenement districts of the near West Side, and the quiet, persistent anxiety of a metropolis that had staked its global reputation on 65 days of perfection. The White City, as the exposition grounds were called, for the plaster of Paris facades that gleamed under newly installed arc lights, was the dream. Inglewood, 3 miles to the southwest, was where the dream's shadow fell. Holmes operated in that shadow. His hotel, he called it the World's Fair Hotel, though it was never licensed as such with the city, stood at the corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street, close enough to the exposition grounds that a visitor disembarking from the elevated rail could walk to his front door in under 20 minutes. He had chosen the location with the precision of a man who understood traffic patterns, who understood that 27 million visitors would include thousands of young women traveling alone for the first time, drawn by the fair's promise of a new American century, carrying their life savings in envelopes tucked inside their traveling cases, with no one in any city expecting them home on any particular day. To understand how Holmes built what he built without interference, you have to understand what Chicago in 1893 was willing to look away from, and why. The city was run, in practical terms, by 3 overlapping systems of power that rarely agreed on anything except the importance of their own expansion. There was the political machine centered on City Hall, presided over by Mayor Carter Harrison Sr., a man of genuine charisma and genuine corruption in roughly equal measure, who won elections by understanding that the laboring poor needed bread and entertainment, and the merchant class needed permits and silence, and who provided all 4 without excessive moral distress. There was the commercial aristocracy, the Marshall Fields, the Philip Armours, the George Pullmans, men who had built fortunes so large that they had ceased to function as human ambitions and had become instead geological features, simply part of the landscape of who owned what and why. And there was the underworld, which in 1893 Chicago was not so much a shadow economy as a parallel one, operating card rooms and policy wheels and houses of accommodation within full sight of police precincts, whose captains received regular envelopes and were grateful for the predictability. Into this structure, a man with a medical degree, a convincing manner, and no compunction whatsoever about lying could insert himself with relative ease. Holmes obtained his building permits through a rotating cast of contractors. He hired and fired them so rapidly and refused to pay so many of them that no single builder ever saw the complete design of the structure. The city inspector who should have flagged the unusual internal architecture of the upper floors visited the site twice in 1891 and once in 1892. All 3 visits were preceded by Holmes' personal invitation to dinner at a restaurant on Michigan Avenue. The inspector filed no citations. Holmes sent him a Christmas hamper each December. Women arriving at the fair without accommodation found Holmes' hotel through advertisements he placed in newspapers in Minneapolis, Indianapolis, and Cincinnati, cities far enough away that their missing persons reports would be filed in different jurisdictions from any investigation that might begin in Chicago. He offered employment, too, secretary positions, pharmacist assistant roles, opportunities he described in correspondence as suited to ambitious young ladies of good character. The phrase good character appeared in nearly every letter. He used it the way a fisherman uses bait, not because he believed it, but because he understood precisely who would respond to it. The law in 1893 was not designed to find someone like Holmes. It was designed to manage predictable categories of crime: theft, assault, the occasional murder of passion in a saloon. A man who built architecture specifically engineered for disappearance, who operated across multiple states under multiple names, who had already committed insurance fraud in at least 4 cities before the fair opened. This was not a category the Cook County Sheriff's Office had a form for. What made the World's Fair Hotel possible was not Holmes's intelligence, though he was intelligent. It was not his charm, though witnesses consistently described him as the most pleasant man they had ever met. What made it possible was the specific texture of 1893, a moment in American history when modernity was moving so fast that it had outrun the social structures designed to protect people from each other. Consider what was normal. It was normal in 1893 for a young woman to travel to Chicago seeking work without any mechanism by which her family could verify her safety from day to day. There was no telephone in most households. A letter took 3 to 5 days. If she wrote home on a Monday and was dead by Wednesday, her mother would receive the letter, probably describing her new lodgings as comfortable, her employer as kind, 4 days after she had ceased to exist. The gap between reality and the family's knowledge of it was wide enough to drive a murder through, and Holmes drove through it repeatedly. It was also normal in that era for a man presenting professional credentials to be taken entirely at his word. Holmes called himself a doctor. He had, in fact, earned a medical degree from the University of Michigan in 1884, a credential he had obtained partly through legitimate study and partly by stealing corpses from the university's laboratory, insuring them and filing fraudulent death claims. He understood medicine well enough to know precisely which chemicals, in which quantities, produced which effects on the human body, and at what point those effects became irreversible. This knowledge, in the context of the unfinished floor, was not academic, it was operational. What was unthinkable, what the city of Chicago in 1893 genuinely could not conceptualize, was that a building itself be a weapon, that the floor plan of a hotel, the placement of a gas pipe, the angle of a chute, could be as deliberately lethal as a firearm. Architecture had a moral neutrality that American law in 1893 had never been asked to challenge. A room was a room, a door was a door. The idea that a room could be designed to be a final room, that a door could be engineered to only open from the outside, that the entire spatial logic of a structure could be organized around the problem of making death efficient and quiet and untraceable. This was not a thing the legal system had language for, which meant it was not, technically, a thing the legal system could prosecute. Not yet. Herman Webster Mudgett was born on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, a small town of white clapboard houses and long winters, and the particular social cruelty of communities where everyone knows the precise gradations of everyone else's poverty. His father, Levi Horton Mudgett, was a Methodist of rigid temperament who believed that discomfort built character, and warmth, expressed too freely, was a form of moral weakness. He expressed this belief consistently throughout Herman's childhood. His mother, Theodate Page Mudgett, was by most accounts a gentlewoman who had married a cold man and adapted to the marriage by retreating into a domestic smallness so complete that she became over time nearly invisible within her own household. Herman was the third of 4 children and the one who unsettled people. Not because he was violent as a boy, he was not, or not in ways that left marks. He unsettled people because of his eyes. Multiple sources, including a childhood neighbor interviewed by the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1895, describe the same quality, that Herman Mudgett looked at you with an attention so complete and so unreadable that it felt less like being seen and more like being assessed, that a conversation with the boy left you with the faint, irrational sense that he had been filing information about you for a purpose he had not yet revealed.
At the age of 11, Herman was dragged by 2 older boys to the office of the local physician, a Dr. Nahum Carpenter, who practiced from a converted front room on Elm Street, and forced, as a prank, to confront the articulated skeleton the doctor kept mounted in the corner for teaching purposes. The boys expected screaming. They got silence. Herman Mudgett stood in front of that skeleton for what witnesses described as an uncomfortably long time, and when he finally turned around, he was smiling. Not the smile of a boy pretending bravery, the smile of a boy who had just been introduced to something he recognized. He began reading medical texts at 12. At 14, he was observed by at least one neighbor conducting what he described as experiments on small animals found near the river behind his family's property. The neighbor, a woman named Abigail Foss, told her husband that she'd seen the Mudgett boy with a jar and that she didn't want to know what was in it. Her husband told her not to be dramatic. Mrs. Foss later said, after Holmes's arrest, that she wished she had been more dramatic and louder and much sooner. He left Gilmanton at 17, worked briefly as a school teacher, a role that gave him authority over people smaller than himself, which he found by his own later admission deeply satisfying, and enrolled at the University of Michigan Medical School in 1882,
It was there, in the anatomy laboratories, surrounded at last by the systematic study of what the human body was and how it failed, that Herman Mudgett understood for the first time that he had found his natural environment. He graduated in 1884. He left Michigan owing money to 11 separate creditors, having conducted at least 2 insurance fraud schemes, using cadavers stolen from the university's own supply, and having seduced and abandoned a woman in Ann Arbor, who would not hear from him again for 6 years, by which point he had married 2 other women under different names in different states, and had begun building, on a corner lot in Inglewood, Chicago, a structure that would make everything that came before it look like preparation. Which, of course, is exactly what it was.
Francis Xavier Geyer was a compact man, 5 feet 9 inches in his boots, with the kind of physical solidity that comes not from size, but from density, as though his body had decided early on to make up in mass what it lacked in height. His hands were his most distinctive feature, and they appeared, in the accounts of colleagues and witnesses alike, with the consistency of a recurring image in a recurring dream. Broad across the knuckles, with fingers slightly too long for the palm, hands that looked made for a different and heavier kind of work than detectives' paperwork, hands that people remembered after they had forgotten his face. Those hands would appear again in this story. They always did. He was born in 1850 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the second son of a German immigrant cabinet maker named Ernst Geyer, who had arrived in Philadelphia in 1841 with $40, a set of chisels, and a Protestant work ethic so severe it bordered on punishment. Frank grew up in a household where silence was the default register of family communication, where meals were eaten quickly and without ceremony, where affection was demonstrated through the quality of work performed, rather than anything so unreliable as words. He did not resent this upbringing. He absorbed it. He became, over time, a man for whom the careful, patient, methodical examination of a problem was not merely a professional skill, but the primary language in which he understood the world. He joined the Philadelphia Police Department in 1874, transferred to the Detective Bureau in 1881, and by 1893 had a clearance rate on homicide investigations that his superiors found both impressive and vaguely unsettling. Unsettling because Geyer achieved it not through the aggressive interrogation tactics common among his colleagues, but through a quality harder to name and harder to replicate. He listened. He listened with the same complete, unrushed attention that other men reserved for problems they were being paid to solve. And he listened to everyone: witnesses, suspects, the neighbors of suspects, the landlords of neighbors of suspects. He listened to women, which in 1893 was not a professional norm, and which produced, repeatedly, information that men less willing to listen never obtained. The wound at the center of Frank Geyer's life was not visible in his posture or his speech or his work, which made it, paradoxically, the most present thing about him. In March of 1889, his wife Martha and their daughter Esther, 9 years old, with her father's long fingers and her mother's way of tilting her head to the left when she was thinking, died within 4 days of each other during a diphtheria outbreak in their neighborhood of West Philadelphia. Geyer was working a double homicide on the night Martha's fever broke the wrong way. He arrived home at 2:30 in the morning to find his daughter sitting at the kitchen table, alone, because Martha had died an hour earlier and no one had known where to send for him. Esther died on a Thursday. Geyer buried them together on a Saturday, returned to work on Monday, and never once in the 6 years that followed discussed it with a colleague. What this loss gave him, and it is important to understand it as a giving, not only a taking, was a specific quality of obsession in cases involving children. He did not become reckless in such cases. He became, if anything, more methodical, more patient, more relentless, in the particular way of a man who has decided that patience is the only form of respect he has left to offer. When the Holmes case landed on his desk in the spring of 1895,
assigned to him specifically because it involved missing children. The 3 young Pitezel children, Howard, Nellie, and Alice, who had vanished in Holmes' custody after the death of their father. Geyer accepted the assignment with a quietness his superiors found difficult to interpret. What it was, in fact, was recognition, the feeling of a man who has spent years preparing for exactly this. His secret, the morally gray truth that his colleagues did not know and his superiors would not have approved, was that Frank Geyer had, on 2 occasions in his career, allowed evidence to disappear. Not planted evidence, not fabricated testimony, simply allowed certain documents, certain statements that would have freed men he was certain were guilty on procedural grounds, to become misfiled, misplaced, temporarily and then permanently unavailable. He had done this without apology, and had buried the knowledge of it in the same interior space where he kept Martha and Esther, deep, organized, and never discussed. He was not a purely good man. He was a man who had decided, at great personal cost, exactly where his lines were, and who understood that lines drawn in grief are not always drawn straight.
Carrie Elmira Pitezel was 31 years old in the autumn of 1894, and she had the specific exhaustion of a woman who has been managing catastrophe for so long that catastrophe had become for her simply the texture of daily life. She was tall, taller than most men she met, which in 1894 was not an asset in any social or professional context, with dark hair that she wore pinned at the back with a practicality that had long since replaced any concern for fashion, and pale gray eyes that people consistently described as the eyes of someone who has recently been told very bad news and is still in the process of deciding what to do about it. Those gray eyes, they appear in every account. They appear in Geyer's case notes. They appear in the newspaper reports. They are the detail that anchors her to every room she ever entered in this story. She had married Benjamin Pitezel in 1880 when she was 17, in a small ceremony in Galva, Illinois, attended by her parents and 2 of Benjamin's brothers and no one else of consequence. Benjamin was not a bad man. He was a weak one, which in certain circumstances amounts to the same thing. He drank with the enthusiasm of someone using alcohol to solve a problem that alcohol was constitutionally incapable of solving, and he had a talent for attaching himself to schemes proposed by more confident men, schemes that were always, in the telling, just about to produce the income that would resolve everything, and that, in the execution, produced nothing except new debts and new explanations for Carrie. Holmes had been Benjamin's employer, then his business partner, then his controller, then his killer, in a progression so gradual that Carrie, watching it from the outside, had not been able to identify the precise moment when the relationship had crossed from one category to the next. This was, she would later tell Frank Geyer, the thing that haunted her most. Not that she had not seen it, that she had seen something, a wrongness in the way Holmes spoke to Benjamin, a quality in Benjamin's obedience that was less like loyalty and more like fear, with the fear taken out and only the obedience remaining, and had told herself that she was being dramatic. Carrie Pitezel's wound was older than Holmes', which is important. She had grown up in a household governed by a father who was, by the standards of rural Illinois in the 1860s, a respectable man, a farmer, a churchgoer, a man of his word in public, and who was, in the privacy of his home, someone whose moods moved through the house ahead of him like weather, causing every other occupant to adjust their behavior before he arrived in any given room. She had learned before she learned to read with full fluency how to manage the emotional temperature of a space occupied by a dangerous man. She had learned to be still, to be small, to offer the particular kind of attentive, placating attention that such men require and that cost the people providing it everything they might otherwise have spent on their own interior lives. This skill, if skill is the right word, which it is not, but language fails here, made her, ironically, the person best equipped to understand Holmes in retrospect. When Geyer finally sat across from her in a borrowed office in Cincinnati in May of 1895 and laid out what he knew of the hotel on 63rd Street, Carrie Pitezel listened with the gray eyes and the straight back and the stillness of a woman reassembling a map she has been carrying in pieces for years. She did not cry. She told Geyer, already used up what she had available for crying approximately 6 months earlier, and she was not yet sure she had the means to replenish it. Her hidden strength was organizational, not in the bureaucratic sense, but in the deeper sense. Carrie Pitezel could hold an enormous number of variables in her mind simultaneously,
track their relationships to each other, and identify the inconsistencies in a narrative the way a musician identifies a note played wrong in a familiar piece, not through analysis but through a calibrated internal sense of how things were supposed to fit. She had been doing this her entire life, tracking the variables of a household organized around an unpredictable center. She was doing it now with the narrative Holmes had fed her over 18 months, the story of Benjamin's death, the story of the insurance claim, the story of why the children needed to travel separately, the story of where they were being kept, the story of when she would see them again. The stories did not fit. They had not fit for months. She had been telling herself they fit. She had been telling herself she was being dramatic. She had a secret, too. In October of 1894, 3 weeks after Holmes had last been seen with her children, Carrie Pidelsel had broken into a locked desk drawer in the room Holmes had rented in Indianapolis and removed a single folded letter. She could not explain afterward why she had done this. A calibrated internal sense of how things were supposed to fit, perhaps. The letter was in Holmes' handwriting and addressed to a woman in Chicago whose name Carrie did not recognize. The letter's contents, which she had memorized and then burned, contained a detail about the Pidelsel children, a specific administrative detail about their travel arrangements that Holmes had explicitly told Carrie he did not know. She had said nothing. She had replaced the letter. She had continued for 3 more weeks, allowing Holmes to manage her movements, her correspondence, her access to information about her own children. She had done this because she was afraid, and because she was calculating, and because she had spent 31 years learning that the most dangerous thing a person in her position could do was let the dangerous man in the room know that she had stopped believing him. It was this letter, its existence, its contents as Carrie could reconstruct them from memory, and the 3 addresses in Holmes' handwriting on its outer fold that she gave to Frank Geyer at the end of their first meeting in Cincinnati. She slid it across the table, handwritten on a page she had torn from a hotel Bible the night before, and then she folded her long-fingered hands in her lap and looked at him with those gray eyes and said with the flatness of someone delivering information they had been warehousing at great personal cost, "I should have come sooner. Tell me what to do now." It was the moment Geyer understood that he was not the only one who had been hunting Holmes. He had simply been the one with a badge. The moment their goals aligned was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday afternoon in a borrowed office with bad light and the sound of a streetcar outside the window. Carrie Pidelsel pushed a piece of paper across a table. Frank Geyer picked it up with those broad, 2 long-fingered hands, and the thing that had been operating in the dark in the sealed rooms of a Chicago hotel, on an unfinished floor that no one had left, was about to meet the 2 people in the world most specifically qualified to find it.
The second meeting between Frank Geyer and Carrie Pidelsel happened not in the borrowed Cincinnati office, but in a boarding house on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the rail depot, on a Wednesday morning in late May of 1895, when the Ohio humidity had already settled over the city like a warm, damp cloth pressed against the face. Geyer had requested the change of location deliberately. Offices, in his experience, produced a particular kind of careful, performative testimony. People in offices spoke to the version of themselves they wished to present to authority. Boarding house parlors, with their worn horsehair furniture and their smell of someone else's breakfast, and their absolute ordinariness, produced something closer to the truth. Carrie arrived 7 minutes early and was sitting at the parlor table when Geyer came through the door, which told him something. A woman who has been managing dangerous situations for a long time does not arrive late to meetings where information will be exchanged. She has learned at a molecular level that being in a room before the other person gives her approximately 45 seconds to read the space and decide where to position herself. She had chosen the chair with her back to the wall and a clear sight line to both the door and the window. Geyer noted this without commenting on it and sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence had the specific quality of 2 people taking the measure of each other, with instruments that were not quite professional and not quite personal. He had brought the Pidelsel file. He laid it on the table between them, not open, just present. A gesture that said, "I have what you think I have," without yet revealing how much of it he understood. Carrie looked at the file the way people look at objects that have caused them significant harm, with a recognition that is also a kind of bracing. "I need you to tell me," Geyer said, "not what happened. I have reports for what happened. I need you to tell me what felt wrong before anything happened. The first moment, the very first thing." Carrie Pidelsel looked at him with the gray eyes. She tilted her head slightly to the left, a gesture of thinking that Geyer would come to know well, and said,
You want the feeling, not the fact. The feeling becomes the fact, Geyer said, eventually. The tension between them in that first real exchange was not hostility. It was the specific wariness of two people who have each, independently, developed a habit of trusting their own judgment over the judgment of others, now confronted with the possibility that the other person's judgment might be worth something. Carrie had spent 18 months being managed by a man who used her trust as a tool. She did not distribute trust freely anymore. Geyer had spent 20 years in a profession where witnesses who seemed helpful were frequently helpful only in the direction of their own interests. He did not accept offered information without turning it over and examining its underside. What broke the initial wariness was not a grand gesture. It was Geyer asking, after 40 minutes of careful, circling conversation, whether she had eaten that morning. She had not. He went to the boarding house kitchen, spoke briefly with the proprietress, and returned with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of bread and butter, which he set on the table with the same methodical precision with which he had set down the file. It was such an ordinary thing. It was so completely unlike the way Holmes had operated, the orchestrated charm, the grand attentiveness, the attention that felt like being assessed, that Carrie Pitezel picked up the bread and ate it, and felt for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember that she was in the presence of someone who was not calculating the value of her comfort against some other variable. She told him about the first moment. It had been in September of 1893 at the World's Fair Hotel, when Holmes had shown her the room he said Benjamin was using for insurance business. The room had a window. The window looked out onto an alley. The alley was always empty. At the time, she had noted this as ordinary. Sitting in the boarding house parlor in Cincinnati in May of 1895, she told Geyer that she now understood why the alley was always empty, and that she would prefer not to say it out loud, but that she believed he already knew. He did. He nodded. He wrote nothing down. The trust between Geyer and Carrie Pitezel was built in 3 specific moments over the following 11 days, each one removing another layer of the professional distance they had both arrived with. The first moment was a test, administered by Carrie without Geyer's knowledge. On the 3rd day of their working collaboration, she told him a detail about Holmes's movements in Indianapolis that she had in fact invented, a meeting with a man she called Gerald Ashworth, a pharmacist on Washington Street, whom she claimed to have seen Holmes visit twice in October of 1894. She gave the name with the same flat, precise delivery she gave every other piece of information. Then she waited. Geyer spent 2 days attempting to locate Gerald Ashworth and Washington Street pharmacy records before returning to Carrie and telling her, without accusation, that the name did not appear in any Indianapolis business directory for that year, and asking whether she might have misremembered it or heard it secondhand. He said this without suspicion in his voice, without the edge that men in his position typically deployed when a witness had wasted their time. Carrie said, "I made him up." Geyer looked at him for a moment. "I know," he said. "I've loaned since yesterday. I wanted to see if you'd tell me." She had not expected this. The competence of it, the quiet, undramatic competence of a man who had caught her test and simply waited for her to conclude it herself, was more persuasive than any display of authority could have been. She decided in that moment that Frank Geyer was the first genuinely trustworthy man she had dealt with in at least 2 years, and possibly longer. The second moment came on the 6th day. Geyer had obtained, through a contact in the Chicago Police Department, a partial floor plan of the upper level of Holmes's hotel. Not the architect's original drawings, which Holmes had deliberately obfuscated through his rotating cast of contractors, but a rough sketch produced from memory by a carpenter named Otto Schaefer, who had worked on the building for 11 days in the spring of 1892, before Holmes had dismissed him without payment. Geyer spread it on the table. It showed in rough pencil lines the configuration of rooms on the upper floor, the unusual angles, the doors positioned in ways that violated standard construction logic, the sealed spaces between walls that were too wide to be insulation and too narrow to be rooms, that were, in architectural terms, simply voids. Carrie looked at the sketch for a long time. Then she pointed to a room in the northeast corner, a room that on the sketch had no visible door on the inside side, and said, "Alice wrote to me from this room. I didn't know it then. I know it now." Her voice was the same flat, precise register it always was. Geyer understood that this was not emotional absence. It was the voice of a woman who had put her emotions somewhere else temporarily because they were not operationally useful right now, and who would retrieve them later, in private, and at great cost to herself. He did not offer condolences. She would not have wanted them. He put his broad hand on the sketch, over the room she had pointed to, and said, "Then that's where we start."
It was the most comfort either of them had the capacity to give or receive, and it was enough. The third moment, the one that completed the architecture of their trust, happened on the 11th day, when Holmes himself nearly intervened. Geyer had been corresponding with the Philadelphia office about Holmes's known aliases, and had sent a telegraph under his own name from the Cincinnati telegraph office on 4th Street that he believed had been intercepted. He had no proof, but the telegraph operator had been replaced between the morning and afternoon sessions, and the new operator had asked questions about the addressee that, in Geyer's judgment, were one question too many. He told Carey that evening that he believed their location might be known to someone in Holmes's network, a network whose existence and reach he was only beginning to map, and that she should consider whether she wanted to continue. She looked at him with the gray eyes. She said, "Where would I go that he doesn't already know about? At least here I'm doing something." The next morning she moved her lodgings without telling the boarding house prophetess her new address, using a name she had used before she was married, and left a message for Geyer with the coffee shop on the corner that said only the word Thursday and a street number. He found it. He showed up on Thursday. And from that point forward, neither of them operated under the assumption that Holmes did not know they were coming. They operated instead under the assumption that it didn't matter, which was either courage or something darker and more useful than courage, and in the context of what they were pursuing, the distinction was largely academic.
It was on a Thursday evening, in Carey's new lodgings, a single room above a dry goods store on Race Street, with one window and a lock she had replaced herself the morning she moved in, that she told Geyer the thing she had not told him in the Cincinnati office, or in the boarding house, or in any of the 11 days of careful, methodical trust-building that had preceded this moment. She told him about November of 1894. Holmes had been in Philadelphia. The insurance fraud scheme, the plan to fake Benjamin's death and collect the $10,000 policy, had already been executed, and Benjamin was already dead, though Carey had not known this yet, had been told he was in hiding, had been managed with such precision that her ignorance was itself part of the mechanism. Holmes had left her in a rooming house in St. Louis with the 3 children, Howard, 9, Nellie, 11, Alice, 15, and had come to Philadelphia to manage the insurance claim. What Carey told Geyer was this, that she had followed Holmes, not all the way to Philadelphia. She had not known he was going to Philadelphia. But for 3 days in early November, she had, without telling anyone, left the children in the rooming house, in the care of the landlady with a story about a sick relative, and had traced Holmes's movements through St. Louis as far as the rail depot, and had watched him purchase a ticket, and had then returned to the children and said nothing. She had seen something at the depot. She had seen Holmes speaking with a man she did not recognize, a heavy-set man in a brown coat, who had handed Holmes a leather case of the size used for medical instruments, and who had received from Holmes in return a folded paper that Carey was too far away to identify. She had told no one. Not then. Not when the children were taken. Not when she was told Howard was in Cincinnati and Nellie and Alice were in Toronto. Not when the letters from Alice stopped coming. Not in any of the months between November and May, when she had been carrying this image, the brown coat, the leather case, the folded paper, like a stone in her chest. "Why?" Geyer said, and his voice had no accusation in it, and no softness either. Simply the directness of a man who needed accurate information. "Did you not report this?" Carey was quiet for a moment. The room above the dry goods store had the particular silence of a city at night. Not truly silent, but all its sounds coming from a distance, muffled, belonging to a world that was continuing its ordinary business and had no idea what was being said in this room. "Because," she said, "if I had reported it, and it had come to nothing, he would have known I was watching him, and I had 3 children. She paused. I made a calculation. I calculated that silence kept them safer than noise. Another pause. Longer this time. I was wrong. I want you to know that I was wrong. I have known it since December. I will know it for the rest of my life." Geyer wrote nothing in his notebook during this. He waited until she was finished. Then he said, "The man in the brown coat. Describe him again. Everything. If you're still watching, if you've stayed with Carey and Geyer this far into the dark, drop a 1993 in the comments. I want to know who's still here."
What Geyer and Carey assembled over the following 4 days was not a plan in the dramatic sense. There was no table covered in maps, no dramatic allocation of roles. It was quieter and more methodical than that, which made it in some ways more frightening, because methodical plans built by people with nothing to lose have a quality of momentum that dramatic plans lack. The framework was this. Geyer would travel city by city, following the trail of Holmes's movements through the autumn and winter of 1894, visiting every hotel, boarding house, and rental property where Holmes had registered under any of his known aliases, H.M. Howard, G.D. Hatch, Alexander Bond, and asking in each location whether any children had been present and whether anyone remembered what had happened to them. Carey would provide him with every letter she had received, every name Holmes had mentioned, every address he had given her for the children's supposed whereabouts, which he had kept, all of them, in a small tin box she carried in her traveling case, because some part of her had understood, even while Holmes was managing her narrative, that paper was the one thing he could not take back once he had given it. The first seed of doubt was geographic. Holmes's letters had placed Howard in Cincinnati, Nellie and Alice in Toronto, but the dates on the letters, cross-referenced with railway timetables that Geyer obtained from the depots in question, made it physically impossible for Holmes to have been in both cities on the days the letters implied. One of the locations was false, possibly both. The children could be anywhere. The second seed of doubt was Carey herself. She was the only witness to Holmes's communications, the only person who had seen his correspondence, the only one who could reconstruct his movements from the inside. If Holmes became aware that she was cooperating with Geyer's investigation, and the intercepted telegraph suggested that awareness might already be forming, she would become a problem he needed to manage. She had already been managed by him once, for 18 months, without fully realizing it was happening. The question of whether it could happen again, whether her own certainty and her judgment could be compromised a second time by someone who understood precisely how her judgment worked, was one that neither she nor Geyer raised explicitly. It was simply present in the room with them, like the sound of the city outside the window, belonging to the same world they were operating in, and impossible to fully ignore. Geyer left Cincinnati on a Monday morning in early June, carrying Carey's tin box of letters and a physical description of the man in the brown coat at the St. Louis depot, whose identity he did not yet know, but whose role in the acquisition of that leather case of medical instruments he had already formed a hypothesis about, a hypothesis so disturbing that he had written it in his personal notebook in a private hand he had developed over 20 years of working cases he did not want anyone else to read over his shoulder. Geyer stood on the platform and watched the train until it was gone. Then she went back to the room above the dry goods store and sat at the small table by the window with the gray eyes and the straight back, and she began, from memory, to write down every word of every conversation she had ever had with H.H. Holmes, in chronological order, from the first to the last. It took her 11 hours. She did not stop for dinner. She had been carrying it long enough. It was time to put it down somewhere outside herself, where it could be used.
Frank Geyer arrived in Indianapolis on a Tuesday, which was, he had learned over 20 years of investigative work, the best day to arrive in a city you needed to extract information from. Mondays produced people who were still organizing themselves after the weekend. Wednesdays and beyond produced people who had already settled into the week's routines and were resistant to interruption. Tuesdays produced people who were just alert enough to be helpful and just unguarded enough to be honest. He checked into the Hotel English on Monument Circle under his own name. He had stopped using aliases after the telegraph incident in Cincinnati, reasoning that if Holmes's network already knew who he was, concealment was less useful than the appearance of confidence, and spent the first evening reading through Carey's letters in chronological order, cross-referencing each address Holmes had provided with a city directory he had purchased at the depot newsstand. Of the 7 Indianapolis addresses mentioned across 9 letters, 3 did not exist. 2 existed but corresponded to vacant lots. 1 corresponded to a commercial laundry on East Washington Street, and 1, a rooming house on Pennsylvania Street operated by a widow named Mrs. Henrietta Doyle, existed, was residential, and had, according to the directory, been in continuous operation since 1887. He visited Mrs. Doyle the following morning. She was a small, precise woman in her 60s who wore her white hair in a style that had been fashionable approximately 15 years earlier,
and who opened her front door with the expression of someone who has been managing other people's problems for so long that the arrival of a new one is neither surprising nor particularly unwelcome. Geyer showed his credentials. She examined them with more thoroughness than most people did, which raised her immediately in his estimation. Yes, she told him. A man calling himself Howard had rented a room in October of the previous year. He had been well-dressed and soft-spoken, and had paid 3 weeks in advance in cash, which Mrs. Doyle noted was unusual, and which she had therefore noted in her ledger with particular care. He had arrived with 3 children, 2 girls and a younger boy, who had been, she said, quiet in the specific way of children who have been told to be quiet, rather than children who are quiet by nature. There is a difference, she said, and looked at Geyer as though daring him to disagree. He did not disagree. He asked her to describe the children. She described Alice first, 15, tall for her age, dark hair, gray eyes. And here Geyer felt something move through him that was not quite professional and not quite personal, but somewhere in the narrow, uncomfortable space between them, because gray eyes were Carrie's gray eyes, were the eyes of the woman sitting in a room above a dry goods store in Cincinnati, writing down every word Holmes had ever said to her. And the image of that inheritance, of those particular eyes in the face of a 15-year-old girl in a rented room on Pennsylvania Street in Indianapolis, was one he filed away carefully and did not look at again until the case was closed. The children had stayed 11 days. The man calling himself Howard had visited 3 times, always in the evening, always for less than an hour. On the 4th visit, the last, he had come with a cart. He had told Mrs. Doyle that the children were being moved to their aunt's house in Chicago. The children had gone with him without protest, which Mrs. Doyle said she had found, at the time, unremarkable. She found it considerably more remarkable now. Geyer asked if anything had been left behind. Mrs. Doyle was quiet for a moment, with the expression of someone deciding whether a thing they have been holding on to has arrived at the correct recipient. Then she went upstairs and returned with a small object that she placed in Geyer's broad hands with the care of someone transferring something fragile. It was a child's hair ribbon, blue, frayed at one end as though it had been tied and untied many times. On the inside of the ribbon, in handwriting that was small and careful and unmistakably adolescent, someone had written a single word in pencil: Mama. Geyer stood in Mrs. Doyle's front hallway with that ribbon in his hands for longer than was professionally necessary. Then he put it in his breast pocket, thanked her, and walked back to the Hotel English in the Tuesday morning heat. And that evening he wrote in his private notebook, in the shorthand no one else could read, a single line that translated as, "She knew she wasn't coming back." The first apparent success of the investigation was the confirmation that Holmes had, in fact, brought the children to Indianapolis, corroborating Carrie's letters, establishing a verifiable point on the geographic trail. The false confidence came in the form of a second witness, a livery stable operator on Meridian Street who remembered the cart, remembered the children, and remembered, crucially, the direction in which the cart had departed. North, toward the rail depot, toward Chicago, or at least toward the line that went there. What neither witness mentioned, because neither had seen it, was the second cart, the cart that had left from the alley behind Mrs. Doyle's boarding house, 2 hours before the first one, carrying something wrapped in canvas that the stable boy who loaded it had been paid 50 cents not to describe to anyone, and who had kept that bargain for 8 months before the story and the 50 cents, and the particular quality of the canvas's weight, began to trouble his sleep in ways that 50 cents was no longer adequate compensation for. This was the thing that went wrong. Not dramatically, not immediately. A small wrongness, a detail slightly off register, like a note played almost correctly. Geyer did not know about the second cart yet. He was heading north, toward Chicago, following the first one. He was following the trail Holmes had intended him to follow.
The thing that changed everything was a name. Specifically, it was a name that appeared in the Indianapolis City Directory under the category of pharmaceutical suppliers, a name that also appeared in Carrie's handwritten reconstruction of her conversations with Holmes as someone Holmes had mentioned once, in passing, as a colleague from his medical school years. The name was not the man in the brown coat from the St. Louis depot. It was someone adjacent to him, someone who had supplied Holmes not with instruments, but with something that required no instruments at all. His name was Dr. Clarence Rufus Hartwell, and he had operated a small pharmaceutical supply business out of a converted warehouse on South Meridian Street since 1889. He was 61 years old, had a wife and 2 adult daughters in Broad Ripple, attended the Second Presbyterian Church with sufficient regularity to be considered a deacon, and had, for a period of approximately 4 years ending in late 1894, supplied Holmes, under the alias G.D. Hatch, with quantities of chloroform that no legitimate medical practice in the state of Indiana could have required. Geyer found Hartwell on a Thursday afternoon, in the warehouse, seated at a desk surrounded by the organized smell of chemical compounds and old paper. He did not waste time. He laid the purchasing records, obtained from the city's pharmaceutical registry, which required suppliers to log bulk chemical sales, on Hartwell's desk, and asked him to explain the volume. Geyer explained it by turning the color of old plaster and saying nothing for approximately 90 seconds, which was itself an explanation of sufficient clarity. What emerged over the following 2 hours, in a conversation that Geyer conducted with the low, patient precision of a man who has learned that silence, deployed correctly, is more persuasive than any question, was this: Hartwell had known, or suspected, or told himself he did not quite know, but had organized his behavior as though he did, that the chloroform he was selling to the man calling himself Hatch was not being used for legitimate surgical purposes. The quantities were wrong. The intervals were wrong. A practicing physician in 1894 did not purchase chloroform in the volumes Hatch requested without a corresponding patient load that would have been visible in any hospital or clinic registry in the city. There was no such registry entry for Hatch. There never had been. Hartwell had continued selling to him because Hatch paid in cash, paid promptly, and had, at their third meeting, said something to Hartwell in a quiet, conversational tone, something about Hartwell's elder daughter, her address in Broad Ripple, her daily routine, her habit of walking to the market on Saturday mornings, that was framed as ordinary small talk, and that functioned, with perfect efficiency, as a threat requiring no explicit threatening language whatsoever. This was the thing bigger than Geyer had expected. Not the chloroform alone. He had hypothesized a chemical component to the killings from the beginning, from the sealed rooms, from the absence of any physical evidence of struggle. What he had not hypothesized was the network. The man in the brown coat, Hartwell, the stable boy, paid 50 cents for his silence. Holmes had not operated alone in the logistical sense. He had operated with a corona of coerced participants, people who knew partial truths, and had been given each of them their own private 50-cent reason to keep the partial truth exactly that, partial. The hotel on 63rd Street had not been merely a building. It had been the center of an administrative system, and Geyer was only now beginning to understand how many people that system had touched and compromised and made complicit in their own contaminated silence. He sent a telegraph to Carey that evening. It said, "Larger than we thought. Stay where you are. Tell no one knew anything." He did not sleep well that night. He lay in his room at the Hotel English and looked at the ceiling and thought about the geometry of it, the way Holmes had constructed not just rooms but relationships, not just architecture but obligation, the way every person in his orbit had been given just enough information to be useful and just enough fear to be silent, and how this meant that the trail Geyer was following was not a trail through neutral territory, but a trail through a landscape of people who had been, each of them, quietly ruined, and who had various reasons of their own for not wanting that ruin examined too closely. He thought about Carey in her room above the dry goods store. He thought about Alice's ribbon in his breast pocket. He did not think about Martha and Esther, because he had learned over 6 years exactly how much of that he could afford to think about while working, and he had reached the limit for this particular evening. He got up at 5 in the morning and began making a list of every city Holmes had passed through in the autumn of 1894.
The first death Geyer documented was Benjamin Pitezel's, which he had known about in outline, but now began to understand in specific, stomach-turning detail. Benjamin had died in a rented house on Callowhill Street in Philadelphia in September of 1894, found by neighbors after a smell that the reporting officer had described in his incident report with the unintentional poetry of a man searching for clinical language to contain something that clinical language was not designed for, had penetrated the walls of the adjacent properties. The official finding had been accidental death by chloroform inhalation, a laboratory mishap, consistent with a man known to conduct small chemical experiments. Holmes had collected the $10,000 insurance payment 16 days later. What Geyer now understood, standing in the records room of the Philadelphia Police Department in the second week of June with the incident report in his hands, was that Benjamin Pitezel had not died by accident and had not died quickly. The chloroform had been administered in insufficient quantities to kill immediately, deliberately so, the coroner's original note suggested, though the coroner had not pursued this line of thinking because he had been given no reason to suspect murder and every administrative reason to conclude his examination efficiently. The insufficiency had extended Benjamin's death across an indeterminate period, hours, possibly longer, in a sealed room in a house where Holmes had ensured that no immediate neighbor had reason to investigate unusual sounds, in a death so precisely calibrated to the border between accident and intention that it had fooled everyone who looked at it. The death was shocking in the way that premeditated suffering concealed as accident always is, not because of its violence, but because of its patience, because of what it revealed about the mind that had designed it. A man who kills in passion is comprehensible. A man who kills with a dosage chart is something the mind resists categorizing as belonging to the same species. The second death was Howard Pitezel's, and it was calculated in the specific sense that a mathematician's solution is calculated, arrived at through a process, executed with precision, designed to produce a predetermined result. Howard was 9 years old. He had been separated from his sisters in October of 1894, told he was going to stay with relatives, and brought to a rented cottage outside Detroit by Holmes under the alias Alexander Bond. The cottage had been rented for 2 weeks. Holmes had visited it 4 times. On the 4th visit, he had stayed for 3 hours. Howard Pitezel had not been seen again after that visit. What Geyer found in the 3rd week of June, in the cellar of that cottage, identified through the rental records of a Detroit property agency and confirmed through the testimony of a neighbor who had seen a man matching Holmes' description arrive and depart on the relevant dates, was a space that had been partially excavated beneath the cottage's stone foundation. Not excavated as renovation, excavated as concealment. The excavation was approximately the size of a 9-year-old boy. It had been filled in. It had been, in the estimation of the Detroit County Examiner who accompanied Geyer to the site, filled in recently enough to be consistent with the October timeline, and filled in with a thoroughness, the careful tamping of the earth, the replacement of the stone flags above it, that spoke of someone who had done this before, or had thought about doing it for long enough that the doing of it had become, in their mind, routine. Geyer stood at the edge of that excavation in the July heat with his broad hands at his sides, and did not speak for a long time. The county examiner said something careful and professional about the need for formal exhumation procedures. Geyer nodded without hearing him. He was thinking about the 9-year-old in that space, and about the September of 1889, and about a different child and a different space, and about the specific cruelty of a world that takes children and puts them in places they were never meant to be. And he was doing what he had learned to do with that thought, filing it somewhere internal, somewhere organized, somewhere it could be retrieved later when it was operationally useful, which in his experience was approximately never, but which he filed anyway because the alternative was not filing it, and the alternative was not something he could afford. The third death was Nellie and Alice together, and it was the worst thing Frank Geyer found in 20 years of detective work, and it is the thing that, in every account of this case, people who knew him said changed something in him permanently, not broke him because he was not a man who broke in visible ways, but changed the quality of his stillness, made it deeper, made it the stillness of something that has looked at a particular darkness and decided, consciously and permanently, not to look away from it. He found them in Toronto, a rented house on St. Vincent Street, identified through the rental records of a Toronto property agency that Holmes had used under the name H.M. Howard, confirmed through the testimony of a neighbor named Mrs. Agnes Carnahan, who had watched 2 girls playing in the back garden of the rented house in late October of 1894, and had thought they seemed, in her words, too serious for children, like they were playing at playing rather than actually playing, like they knew it was the last time and were trying to do it carefully. Mrs. Carnahan had told no one this observation at the time, because she had no reason to. She told Geyer on a Wednesday morning in July, with the particular distress of a woman who has been hearing a witness detail for 8 months without knowing it was evidence. The house on St. Vincent Street had a basement. The basement had a trunk. The trunk, a large commercial-grade steamer trunk of the kind used for extended travel, reinforced at the corners with brass fittings, the kind of trunk that, closed and locked, gave no indication whatsoever of its contents, had been pushed against the north wall of the basement, behind a stack of old newspapers, in a position that suggested it had been placed there to not be found rather than placed there for any purpose of storage. Geyer had the Toronto police open it. He did not describe in his official report what he felt in the moment the lock was broken. He described in precise professional language what was inside. The Toronto City Examiner's report, filed on July 15, 1895, and sealed by court order within 4 days of its filing, contained measurements and findings that established the cause and approximate manner of death with clinical accuracy. The document has never been fully released. What has been established from the partial public record, from Geyer's private notebooks, and from the testimony of the Toronto police officer who was present at the opening of the trunk and who retired from the force 18 months later citing reasons he declined to specify, is this. Holmes had been thorough.
He had been thorough in the way that the sealed rooms at the hotel on 63rd Street were thorough, in the way that the excavation beneath the Detroit cottage was thorough, in the way that a man who has been thinking about something for a very long time is thorough, not hurried, not careless, not passionate. Deliberate. Architectural. He had designed the deaths of Nellie and Alice Pitezel with the same spatial intelligence he had applied to the building on 63rd Street, which meant that what was in that trunk was not simply what had been done to two children, but was a demonstration, a proof, of a mind that experienced the space between a living person and a dead one as a design problem to be solved rather than a moral limit to be observed. Geyer closed his notebook. He went outside. He stood in the Toronto summer heat on St. Vincent Street and looked at the sky for a very long time. Then he went back inside and continued working, because there was no other option, and because there were two girls in a trunk on the north wall of a basement who had written Mama on a hair ribbon and had played in a back garden too carefully, and because the man who had put them there was still alive and had not yet been asked to account for any of it. The exposure came not in Toronto but in Philadelphia, and it came not through Holmes' network, but through a bureaucratic failure so ordinary that it was almost insulting in its smallness. Geyer had sent a telegraph from Toronto to the Philadelphia Superintendent of Police requesting that Holmes, who had been arrested in Boston in November of 1894 on an unrelated horse fraud charge and had been held and released and rearrested in a legal process of such labyrinthine inefficiency that he had given 3 newspaper interviews during it, be held for formal questioning in connection with the Pitezel deaths. The telegraph had been received. It had been logged. It had been placed in a file. The file had been given to an officer who was the professional acquaintance of a court-appointed attorney who had, for reasons that were never fully investigated, informed his client of the incoming inquiry before the police had located him. Holmes, who was at that moment residing in a rooming house in Burlington, Vermont under the name Alexander Bond, and who had been conducting, with what could only be described as audacity, a new insurance correspondence from that address, received this information on a Thursday afternoon. He packed a single bag. He was out of the rooming house by Thursday evening. He was across the Vermont border by Friday morning. Geyer received the news in a telegraph office in Pittsburgh, where he had stopped en route back from Toronto. He read the message, subject alerted, location unknown, whereabouts. And the telegraph cut off there, mid-sentence, because the operator in Philadelphia had been interrupted and had sent before completing the message, and so the word whereabouts hung at the end of Geyer's intelligence, like a sentence with the ground removed from under it. He stood in the Pittsburgh telegraph office with the paper in his broad hands, and understood with the clarity of a man who has been methodical and patient and correct about almost everything, that Holmes now knew the precise extent of what Geyer had found. That the advantage of investigative surprise, the only real advantage he had possessed, was gone. That Holmes was moving, and that a moving Holmes, with his network of aliases and his talent for inserting himself into the administrative blind spots of every city he entered, was a problem of a different order than a stationary one. And that somewhere between Burlington, Vermont, and the border he could cross into, Canada to the north, east to the east, the vast interior of the country in every other direction, was a man who now knew that Frank Geyer had opened the trunk on St. Vincent Street and had not.
What follows is reconstructed from Holmes's written confession submitted to the Hearst newspaper syndicate in April of 1896 while he awaited execution in Moyamensing Prison, Philadelphia. He was paid $500 for it. He negotiated the fee himself from his cell through his attorney. The original manuscript ran to 60 pages. What was published was 11. The remaining 49 pages were sealed by court order and have not been made available to any researcher, journalist, or historian in the 130 years since their sealing. What follows draws from the published portions, the partial transcript of his murder trial, and the private testimony of the prison chaplain, Father Michael Donahue, who spent 14 evenings with Holmes in the 6 weeks before his execution, and who wrote about those conversations in a private journal that was discovered among his effects after his own death in 1931 and has never been published in full. I want to begin with what I am not, because everyone who has written about me has begun with what I am, and they have gotten it wrong in ways that would be almost amusing if the wrongness were not so complete. I am not a monster. I want you to understand this not because I expect your sympathy. I have never required sympathy, which is itself perhaps the thing you find most monstrous about me, but because the word is inaccurate, and I have always found inaccuracy intolerable. A monster is something outside the human, something other, something that arrived from a different origin and operates by different mechanics than the rest of you. I did not arrive from a different origin. I arrived from Gilmanton, New Hampshire, from a cold house with a cold father and a mother who had learned to make herself invisible, which is perhaps the most useful education I received, because invisibility, the capacity to be in a room without the room organizing itself around your presence,
to be perceived as ordinary when you are anything but, is the only skill that actually matters if you intend to do what I intended to do. What I intended to do was understand the world as it actually is, rather than as it presents itself. The world presents itself as a moral system, as a place where actions have consequences proportional to their weight, where the good are protected by structures built for that purpose, and the guilty are identified and held accountable by those same structures. I understood by the time I was 14 that this presentation was a performance, that the structures were theatrical, that the distance between what the world claimed to be and what it actually was, that gap, that specific and enormous gap, was not a flaw in the system, it was the system, and that a man willing to operate in that gap, rather than on the illuminated stage where everyone else was performing their goodness, could do almost anything, almost indefinitely, with almost no interference from anyone. I chose the hotel because a hotel is the most perfect expression of the gap I have just described. A hotel is a place where the social contract is visibly suspended, where people arrive who are not known, who give names that are accepted without verification, who occupy spaces temporarily and then disappear without their disappearance being remarkable. A hotel is a place that society has already decided to not look at too carefully. I simply took that existing inattention and gave it architecture. The upper floor was not, as has been reported, a place of chaos. I find the descriptions in the newspapers almost insulting in their sensationalism, the lurid language about torture chambers, about horror, about evil. These words belong to the performance, not to the reality. The reality was precise, methodical. The rooms were designed with specific purposes, and those purposes were executed with the same attention to detail that any competent professional brings to their practice. I was, above all, a professional. The gas pipes were calibrated. The vault was measured to dimensions I had worked out mathematically over a period of months. The chute to the basement laboratory was angled at 17 degrees. I remember the specific calculation, because 17 degrees produced the correct velocity without producing the kind of impact that would compromise what I needed to examine afterward. I will tell you the thing that the newspapers could not print, and that the court did not ask me about directly, because I believe you are owed the most accurate account I can provide, and because accuracy has always been for me a form of respect. There was a moment, with each one, that I found genuinely beautiful. I use the word knowing what it will cost me with you, knowing that it is the word most likely to produce in you the reaction of revulsion that confirms your categorization of me as monster rather than man. I use it anyway because it is accurate. The moment the particular individual in the room stopped performing their own humanity, stopped the negotiating, the pleading, the performing of innocence and worth, and the specific theater that people engage in when they believe theater might save them, and simply became what we all are underneath the performance, a biological system, an arrangement of components, a thing that the universe assembled temporarily and will disassemble with complete indifference. In that moment, the performance was over. The gap between what the world claimed to be and what it was had collapsed entirely, and what was left was honest. For the first and last time, completely honest. I did not enjoy the deaths. I want to be precise about this. I was not stimulated by suffering in the way that the prosecution implied, in the way that satisfies a courtroom's need for a comprehensible motive. What I experienced was closer to the satisfaction of a proof completed, of a hypothesis confirmed, of a question answered with the only kind of evidence that cannot be argued with. The children were a different category, and I will not discuss them in the same register. I am aware of what I did. I am aware that there is no philosophical framework, including my own, that accommodates it without fracture. I did what the situation required, and the situation was of Benjamin Pitezel's making as much as mine, and I have said what I intend to say about it, and I will not say more. Not because I am ashamed. Shame requires a belief in the moral system whose performance I have already explained I do not share, but because the children are the one place where my own internal accounting does not balance, and I find even now that I prefer not to examine imbalances I cannot resolve. What I will say is this: the floor that they called unfinished was the most finished thing I ever built. Every other structure in my life, my marriages, my business arrangements, my professional presentations, was provisional, improvisational, performed for an audience I could not entirely control. The upper floor of the hotel on 63rd Street was built for no audience. It was built for the gap. It was the only place in my life where I did not have to perform anything at all. I have been asked, by the chaplain who visits me, whether I feel remorse. Father Donahue is a kind man and asks the question with genuine hope, which I find touching in the way that one finds touching any sincere belief in a system that the evidence does not support. I told him that I feel something when I think about the hotel, something that sits in my chest in a way that is not comfortable and not exactly painful, but is present, persistent, and resistant to examination. I told him that I did not know what to call it,
He said, "Perhaps that is where your humanity has been waiting." I thought about this for several days. I concluded that he was probably right, and that it had waited there for a very long time, and that it had waited in a space approximately the size of a sealed room, and that the irony of this was not lost on me, and that I was not sure irony was sufficient. I built something that cannot be unbuilt. That is the only true thing I have ever made. I am not proud of it. I am also not proud of it. I am simply its architect. And architects, in the end, are remembered by what they built long after the building is gone.
Holmes was captured in Boston on November 17, 1894, not by Geyer, not through the methodical city-by-city trail that had led from Indianapolis to Detroit to Toronto to the Pittsburgh Telegraph Office, but by a Boston police detective named James Hennessy, who had been tracking an unrelated horse swindle complaint filed by a man named Minnie Williams's business partner, and who recognized Holmes from a description circulated by the Philadelphia office 3 weeks earlier. The capture itself was almost anticlimactic. Holmes was eating breakfast at a boarding house on Causeway Street when Hennessy knocked. He answered the door. He was still holding his coffee cup. He did not run. This was the first thing that unsettled Geyer when he received the telegraph in Pittsburgh, that Holmes had not run, that a man who had anticipated Geyer's investigation sufficiently to flee Burlington, Vermont on a Thursday evening, had then traveled to Boston, a major city with active police connections to Philadelphia, and had settled into a boarding house on Causeway Street and was eating breakfast when they came for him. There were two possible explanations. One was that Holmes had made an error, a lapse in the vigilance that had sustained him for over a decade. The other was that Holmes had decided, for reasons of his own, to be found. That the capture was, in some sense he had not yet been asked to explain, intentional. Geyer arrived in Boston on November 19th and was given 20 minutes with Holmes in a holding room at the Charles Street Jail. He brought nothing with him, no files, no photographs, no evidence. He sat across from Holmes with his broad hands flat on the table and looked at him with the patient, unreadable attention of a man who has learned that silence, deployed correctly, is more persuasive than any question. Holmes looked back with the pale, pleasant eyes that every witness had described as his most disarming feature, the eyes that had functioned for over a decade as the primary instrument of his professional presentation, that had convinced landladies and insurance agents and young women traveling alone that here was a man of warmth and reliability and good character. In the holding room of the Charles Street Jail, those eyes had a different quality, not because they had changed, because Geyer was looking at them with the knowledge of the trunk on St. Vincent Street, and that knowledge changed the eyes the way knowing a language changes the sounds of its words. The sounds were the same, but what they meant was now irrevocably different. Holmes spoke first. He said, "You found them in Toronto." It was not a question. Geyer said nothing. "I want you to know," Holmes said, with the pleasant reasonableness of a man discussing a mutual acquaintance's recent misfortune, that the Toronto arrangement was not my preferred solution. There were logistical constraints that limited my options considerably. Geyer said, "Howard." Holmes looked at him. For the first time in the 20 minutes Geyer had been given, something moved behind the pale eyes, a shift subtle as the movement of water under ice, that was not quite emotion and not quite the absence of it. "Detroit," Holmes said. "You found Detroit." "And Philadelphia," Geyer said. "And the hotel." Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Geyer recorded in his private notebook and that has never appeared in any official document. He said, "I expected you specifically. I read about the Peitzel assignment in the Philadelphia Inquiry. They published your name." A pause. "I thought you would be faster." Geyer understood then. The breakfast in Boston. The unanswered door. The coffee cup still in his hand. Holmes had been waiting. Not because he had run out of options. A man of his operational ingenuity did not run out of options in the sense that ordinary fugitives did. He had been waiting because he had decided that Geyer was the correct audience for the end of the story, that the man who had opened the trunk on St. Vincent Street was the appropriate person to close the account. It was the most disturbing thing Holmes did, in a career of disturbing things, because it was generous, because it was, in its deeply pathological way, respectful. The formal confrontation, the trial itself, began in October of 1895 in Philadelphia and lasted 6 days, which the newspapers found inadequate, and which Holmes himself described to Father Donahue as rushed,
a word he used with the distaste of a craftsman commenting on shoddy work. He dismissed his own attorneys twice. He cross-examined witnesses with a competence that the court reporter described as unsettling in someone representing themselves on 27 counts of murder. He was convicted on November 2, 1895, on the single count of Benjamin Peitzel's murder, the prosecution having made the strategic decision to establish guilt on the most documentable death rather than risk the entire case on the more complex evidence surrounding the children. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out at Moyamensing prison. The justice was as Geyer had warned Carey it would be, morally complicated. The 26 other counts were never prosecuted. The ceiling rooms on the unfinished floor were documented, catalogued, and then demolished as the building was razed in August of 1895, a decision made by the city with a speed that suggested administrative embarrassment as much as public safety. The building was gone before the trial concluded. The evidence it contained, much of it, was gone with it. The man in the brown coat was never formally identified. Clarence Rufus Hartwell, the pharmaceutical supplier, was questioned once and released. The stable boy who had been paid 50 cents was never found. The methods Geyer had used in Toronto, his entry into the house on St. Vincent Street without a Canadian warrant, his examination of the trunk before the formal involvement of Toronto police, the chain of evidence custody that a skilled defense attorney could have challenged, and that Holmes's own attorneys raised and then inexplicably dropped. These were things that Geyer did not discuss publicly and did not enter into the official record. He had done what the situation required. He had made the same kind of calculation that Carey had made in November of 1894, the calculation she had identified as wrong, except that his calculation had led to finding the children rather than losing them, and he was not sure, had never been sure in the years afterward, whether the correctness of the outcome absolved the method, or whether that was simply what every person who had ever crossed a line told themselves, including the man now awaiting execution in Moyamensing prison.
The impossible choice came to Carey Peitzel on a Tuesday morning in March of 1896, 6 weeks before Holmes's scheduled execution, in the form of a letter delivered to her current address in Galva, Illinois, an address she had not given to Holmes, had not given to the press, had given to 3 people in the world, one of whom was Frank Geyer. The letter was in Holmes's handwriting. It was written on Moyamensing prison stationery, which meant it had passed through the prison's outgoing mail system, which meant that either the system had failed to screen it, or the system had been used rather than circumvented, which meant that someone inside the administrative structure of Moyamensing prison had chosen to let it through. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph contained an apology, not for what he had done. The letter did not characterize his actions in any way that constituted acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It apologized for the management of the insurance arrangement, which he described as having become more complicated than he had intended. The apology had the quality of a man apologizing for a dinner party that had run long. It was the most chilling thing Carey had ever read, and she had, over the previous 2 years, read a great deal that qualified. The second paragraph told her that there was a man named Thomas Elgin, a former business associate operating out of Cincinnati, who was in possession of a document that, if submitted to Holmes's appellate attorneys before March 31st, would produce grounds for a new trial on a procedural technicality related to the warrant used in the initial Philadelphia search. The document would not exonerate Holmes. It would delay the execution, potentially for years. Elgin would surrender the document to Carey if she presented herself at his Cincinnati address before the end of the month. Holmes did not explain why Elgin would do this. He did not explain how he knew Elgin would do this. He signed the letter with his full legal name, Herman Webster Mudgett, which he had not used publicly since his arrest. Carey sat at her kitchen table in Galva with that letter for 3 hours. She was not deciding whether Holmes deserved to live. She had no uncertainty about that. She was deciding something harder, whether she was the kind of person who would allow the manner of his dying to be influenced by a system, the legal system, the procedural system, the system of warrants and chains of evidence and appellate technicalities, that had failed her children so completely that they had ended up in a trunk on the north wall of a basement in Toronto. Whether she owed that system her deference, her cooperation, her willingness to perform her faith in its mechanisms, even now. She was also deciding whether she trusted Frank Geyer, whether the information about her address had come from him or through him or despite him, whether the man who had put Alice's ribbon in his breast pocket and had opened the trunk in Toronto without a Canadian warrant, and had built with her a case across 6 cities through 11 months of methodical, patient, relentless work, whether that man was someone whose procedural violations she was now being asked to protect by doing nothing, and whether doing nothing was itself a choice, and whether a choice made by omission was less a choice than a choice made by action, and whether the moral framework she was using to evaluate all of this was one she actually believed in,
or one she had simply inherited and not yet had adequate occasion to examine. She burned the letter. She sat at the kitchen table and held it over the lamp and watched it go, and she did not contact Thomas Elgin, and she did not tell Frank Geyer about the letter for 4 months, and when she finally told him, in a letter of her own, she said only that she had received a communication and had destroyed it, and that she believed she had made the correct decision, and that she was no longer entirely sure what correct meant in a context like this one, and that she hoped he was well. Geyer received her letter in Philadelphia in July of 1896, 2 months after Holmes had been hanged on May 7th. He read it in his office on Chestnut Street with the broad hands flat on the desk and the patient, unreadable stillness that was the primary register of his interior life. Then he filed it in the Pitezel case folder. He did not respond. He did not need to. He understood what she had decided and why, and he understood that her uncertainty about the word correct was the most honest thing she could have said, and he understood it because he shared it, and had shared it since the morning in Toronto when he had broken a lock without a warrant and seen what was inside, and had known in that moment that he was going to find out everything, whatever it cost, and that the cost was a question he would be paying the answer to for the rest of his life. Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing Prison at 10:17 in the morning on May 7, 1896. The execution was attended by 12 official witnesses, 2 prison physicians, Father Donahue, and the sheriff of Philadelphia County. It lasted approximately 15 minutes from the reading of the sentence to the final pronouncement of death. The newspapers reported that Holmes had remained calm throughout, which the witnesses confirmed, and which no one found comforting. His final request, submitted in writing to the prison warden 4 days before the execution, was unusual. He asked that his body be encased in concrete before burial. He specified the depth of the concrete, the mixture ratio, and the dimensions of the encasement. He gave as his reason the wish to prevent what he called posthumous disturbance of his remains, by which he meant dissection, a practice he had himself performed on others, with full professional knowledge of its mechanics, throughout his career. The request was granted. Herman Webster Mudgett was buried under 10 inches of concrete in Holy Cross Cemetery in Philadelphia. The grave has no headstone by his own instruction. The precise location within the cemetery was recorded by the warden and sealed in the prison's administrative file, where it remains inaccessible to this day. In his cell at Moyamensing after the execution, Father Donahue found a single piece of paper on the desk. It was blank except for one line, written in Holmes's precise medical school handwriting in the center of the page. The line said, "I was born with the devil in me." This sentence was subsequently reported in every major newspaper in the country as Holmes's final statement, and it has been quoted in virtually every account of the case written in the century since. Father Donahue told no one until the private journal discovered after his death in 1931 that the sentence was not complete, that when he found the paper, the line read in full, "I was born with the devil in me, and I have never been able to decide whether the devil was something added or something merely revealed." The journal was found. The sentence was not published until 1952, in an academic monograph with a limited print run. It has never entered the popular account of the case, which is perhaps its own kind of answer.
The hotel on South Wallace Avenue was demolished in August of 1895, before the trial concluded, in a decision authorized by the Chicago Bureau of Buildings, with a speed that several contemporary observers found unusual, and that at least one alderman, in a letter to the Chicago Tribune published on September 4, 1895, described as motivated by concerns other than structural integrity. The alderman did not specify what those other concerns were. The letter was his last published statement on the subject. He did not seek re-election in 1896. The architectural drawings for the upper floor, the original plans, if they ever existed in a form separate from Holmes's own modifications, have never been located. Holmes employed across the 3-year construction period of the hotel 112 different contractors, none of whom were ever shown the complete building plan. The city building permits for the upper floor were filed under a business name, the H. Holmes Realty and Accommodation Company, that was dissolved in November of 1893, and whose filing records were transferred to the Cook County Municipal Archive in 1894, where they were catalogued, and where they subsequently ceased to exist. The catalog entry remains. The documents it references do not. In 1937, a historian named Dr. Emil Schaefer, no relation to the carpenter Otto Schaefer whose sketch Geyer had used, submitted a formal request to the Cook County Archives for access to any remaining Holmes-related municipal documents. He received a reply, on official letterhead, informing him that the relevant files had been reviewed and found to contain no material of historical significance. This reply was signed by a deputy archivist whose name does not appear in any other Cook County employment record before or after that date.
Dr. Schaefer published a monograph in 1939 arguing that the systematic disappearance of documentary evidence related to the Holmes case was not attributable to ordinary archival entropy, but represented a coordinated suppression effort originating from within the Cook County municipal government, motivated by the presence of names in the original permit records that connected the hotel's construction approval to senior political figures in the Harrison administration. The monograph was published by a small academic press in Cincinnati, received 2 reviews, and went out of print within a year. Dr. Schaefer died in 1941. His personal research files, which his widow donated to the University of Illinois library system, were processed and cataloged in 1943. The catalog exists. 17 of the folders it references do not. There is one detail about the hotel on 63rd Street that has not been explained by any account, official or otherwise, in the 130 years since the building's demolition. When the demolition crew began work on the upper floor in August of 1895, the foreman, a man named Patrick Culhane, whose account was recorded in a deposition filed in a civil liability suit in 1896, and which represents the only surviving first-hand description of the upper floor's physical state at the time of demolition, reported that several of the sealed rooms, when opened by the demolition crew, contained evidence of recent occupancy. Not occupancy in the period of Holmes's operation of the hotel, recent occupancy. Specifically, food remnants that the foreman estimated were no more than 2 weeks old, a candle burnt down to the holder, and in one room, the room in the northeast corner, the room without an interior door, the room that corresponded to the position Carrie Pitzel had identified on Otto Schaefer's sketch as the room from which Alice had written, a set of initials scratched into the plaster of the interior wall at a height consistent with a kneeling adult, not with a standing one. The initials were not the Pitzel children's initials. They did not correspond to any identified victim of Holmes. They were not in Holmes's handwriting, which was well documented. The deposition does not record what the initials were, noting only that the foreman had seen them and had reported them to the site supervisor, and that the site supervisor had told him to continue with the demolition. The demolition continued. The wall came down. Whatever was scratched into the plaster of the northeast room on the unfinished floor of the World's Fair Hotel on South Wallace Avenue, whatever those initials were, whoever had kneeled in that room and made them, after Holmes was in custody and before the crew arrived to take the building apart, is gone, has been gone for 130 years, is, as far as any surviving record indicates, the one part of this story that has no explanation, no source, no name attached to it. Just the height from the floor, just the posture of kneeling, just the gesture of a person who needed, for reasons we cannot reconstruct, to leave something of themselves in that room before the room ceased to exist.
What this story reveals about human nature is not the thing that the newspapers revealed when they covered it in 1895, and not the thing that the books written since have tended to reach for. The comfortable horror of the monster, the satisfying otherness of the man who was not like us, the reassuring category of the aberration. Holmes was not an aberration. He was an intensification. He took qualities that exist in ordinary measure in ordinary people, the capacity for performance, for the management of others' perceptions, for the strategic deployment of charm and attention as instruments of control, and he developed them over decades of deliberate practice into something that the scale of its consequences made monstrous, but that in its component parts was recognizable. The building on 63rd Street was not built by a different kind of human. It was built by a human who had decided, at some point in a cold house in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, that the gap between what people presented and what they were was not a moral problem to be solved, but an operational resource to be exploited, and who had spent the rest of his life testing how far that decision could be taken. What it means for us today is a question about attention, about the quality of the attention we bring to the spaces and systems and relationships in our lives, and about what we choose, for convenience or comfort, or the ordinary exhaustion of being alive, to not look at too carefully. The hotel on 63rd Street operated for 3 years in a major American city during one of the most heavily attended public events in the country's history. 27 million people came to Chicago in 1893. They rode the elevated rail. They walked the streets of Inglewood. They passed the building on South Wallace Avenue. They saw a hotel under construction. They saw a doctor. They saw, in the window of his pharmacy on the ground floor, a pleasant-faced man of good character, who was always, in every account, so very glad to see them. Nobody looked at the upper floor. Nobody asked why the alley behind the building was always empty. Nobody asked the contractors why they kept changing.
The 27 million people at the World's Fair were looking at the White City, at the arc lights and the lagoons, and the promise of a new century. And the White City was genuinely magnificent, and the magnificence was genuine, and it was also, with perfect efficiency, a direction, a thing to look at so that other things could remain unlooked at. The unanswered question that haunts, the one that this story leaves in the room with you after everything else has been resolved and demolished and sealed and filed in restricted archives and buried under 10 inches of concrete, is not about Holmes. It is about the kneeling, about whoever was in the northeast room in the 2 weeks between Holmes' arrest and the demolition crew's arrival, scratching initials into a wall at the height of someone who could not stand, in a room with no interior door, in a building that the city had already decided to not look at anymore. Who were they? How did they get in? Why did they kneel? What did they need to leave behind? We do not know. The record does not say. The wall is gone, and the thing about walls is that once they come down, it is not only the plaster that disappears, it is everything the plaster knew.
If this story stayed with you, if it made you think, made you uncomfortable, or made you angry, then it did its job. Because the hotel on 63rd Street was not an anomaly sealed safely in the past. It was a lesson about what happens when a city decides that some floors are better left unexamined, some alleys better left unwalked, some questions better left unasked. Holmes did not succeed because he was a genius. He succeeded because everyone around him was busy looking at the lights. Drop a comment below with this question. If you had been in Chicago in 1893, if you had walked past that building every day, do you think you would have noticed? And if you had noticed, do you think anyone would have believed you? If you found this channel for the first time today, subscribe now, because every story we tell here is one they tried to bury. The demolished buildings, the sealed archives, the initials scratched into walls that no longer exist. We bring them back. Next week, we go inside the case they called unsolvable, the systematic disappearance of 36 women from a single American town between 1901 and 1911, and the one postmaster who kept a list that the FBI classification system has never fully released. The town had one road in, it had one road out, and the women only ever took one of them.